He is currently an affiliate of Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation. He is also a non-resident senior fellow with the Brookings Institution. His interests are nuclear arms control, Ukraine, Russia, and European security. A retired Foreign Service officer, Ambassador Pifer's more than 25 years with the State Department, including assignments as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State with responsibilities for Russia and Ukraine, and Ambassador to Ukraine. Stephen also was a special assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia on the National Security Council. He also served in the U.S. embassies in Warsaw, Moscow, and London, as well as with the U.S. delegation to the negotiation on the intermediate range nuclear forces in Geneva. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Pifer, who will share his insights, knowledge, and experience with us as he speaks about the war on Ukraine. Welcome, Ambassador Pifer.
First of all, can everybody hear me and see the slides? Great. Okay, well, Russia is now fighting the largest war in Europe since World War II ended in 1945. It's now almost to its one-year anniversary. That'll be in about 2 weeks. And the war is clearly not going as the Kremlin expected or hoped. So what I plan to do, I'll talk a bit about the course of the war, what might happen in the future, and then U.S. policy. But let me begin by asking, why should Americans care? Okay, I mean, Ukraine, it's 5,000 miles away. China, I think, is the big strategic challenge facing the United States, and there certainly is a lot on the American foreign policy plate. So let me give you several reasons why I think Ukraine matters. First of all, going back for more than 70 years, the United States has defined a stable and secure Europe as a vital American interest. And that's due to political factors, security factors, economic factors. And how this war between Russia and Ukraine plays out is going to have a big impact on that. If Russia prevails, we're going to have to devote more attention to a less stable and less secure Europe. And as I noted, I think Russia, I believe, is actually a country in decline. And the major challenge facing the United States in strategic terms is how do you deal with a rising China in the next several decades? However, if we don't get the Russia-Ukraine war right, we're going to find that Europe demands more time, more American military resources, more other things, and particularly that valuable commodity in Washington time that we would otherwise be devoting to addressing the challenge posed by China. A second reason why I think we should be concerned is the United States has benefited over the last 70 years from a rules-based international order. That's been good for America, it's been good for the West, it's been good for lots of countries. I mean, China basically used this rules-based international order to lift 600 million people out of poverty. But what Russia is doing now is shredding some of the most basic rules of that order. The first one being that states should not use military force to take territory from other states. And if we lose that international order, that, I believe, is not going to be good for the United States. If we get into a dog-eat-dog free-for-all, it's going to be harder for the United States to advance its interest on a range of questions. A third issue is we have to worry about Vladimir Putin's ambitions. Do they end with Ukraine? In June of last year, he had a talk with a group of business students up in St. Petersburg. And one of the students talked about Peter the Great capturing the Baltic states. And Putin says, no, 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 no. Peter the Great did not capture the Baltic states. He regained historic Russian land. And Putin then went on to compare himself in what he's doing in Ukraine with Peter the Great and said, we're not conquering territory. We are regaining historic Russian land. Well, now this is a map of the Russian Empire. At one point included not only the Baltic states, but a good chunk of Poland and all of Finland. The Baltic states and Poland are now members of NATO. Finland, I believe, shortly will be a member of NATO. And although I think it's not a high probability, if Putin's ambitions go beyond Ukraine to historic lands, and for example, include Eastern Estonia, well, in Ukraine, we're sending money and weapons. If it gets to a Baltic state, we're going to be sending money, weapons, and American soldiers. So I think it's better to stop Putin in Ukraine than farther to the west. And finally, a last reason why I think we should care about Ukraine is we told them we would care. And I have to confess, I'm a bit personally involved in this in the early 1990s. I was directly involved in these negotiations, but when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine had on its territory what was then the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. And that included 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads that were designed, built, and deployed to strike targets in the United States. Ukraine gave those weapons up in 1994, agreed to do so, largely in part because in December of 1994, President Yeltsin of Russia, President Kuchma of Ukraine, British Prime Minister Major, and President Clinton signed the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances for Ukraine. And in that document, the United States, Britain, and Russia committed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, its territorial integrity, its independence, and committed not to use force or threaten to use force against Ukraine, of course, commitments that Russia has now totally shredded. But in negotiating that document, when our Ukrainian counterparts asked us, they said, what happens if the Russians violate their commitments? And we told them that, look, we will take an interest, the United States will care. We said, we are not going to commit to provide American troops to you. That's why it's called the Budapest Memorandum of Security Assurances, not security guarantees. But we will be there. And I think what the United States has done over the past year is indicative of that. Now, we're well into month 11 of this war. I think you can see several different phases. Phase one, early on, and you had the Russians invade Ukraine coming out of the north in Belarus, out of Russia proper, out of occupied Donbass in the east, and out of occupied Crimea in the south. And I think what those vectors showed was that the Russian military had two objectives. One was to quickly capture Kyiv, the capital, and second was to occupy perhaps the eastern 1/2 to 2/3 of Ukraine. Now, the Russian military made some progress in the south. They, in fact, secured the entire coast of the Sea of Azov in the southeast, but they utterly failed in their effort to take Kyiv. And by the end of March, within 5 weeks of the war, they had suffered both major personnel and equipment losses. And in essence, they decided they could not take Kyiv. And Russian forces withdrew from Kyiv, withdrew from the entire part of northern Ukraine. And that opened up phase two in April, where the Russian military, and those blue areas show the areas where the Russians retreated. But in phase two, beginning in April, the Russians said, we're going to concentrate on Donbass. That's the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in the far eastern part of Ukraine. You can see them on the right side of the map there over here. It took the Russians 3 months in a very grinding offensive to occupy all of Luhansk Oblast, but they didn't make that much progress in Donetsk. And by July, it looked like the battle lines were beginning to settle down. However, phase three of the war began in September, when the Ukrainians launched a large counteroffensive up in Kharkiv, and you see that blue area there. Basically, over the course of September, they pushed the Russian military out of Kharkiv Oblast and actually began to move Ukrainian forces back towards Luhansk. And then began down in the southern part, north of Crimea, they began preparing for a counteroffensive around Kherson. I think in September, we began to see Putin become a little bit desperate. Putin had talked about this war from the beginning as a special military operations, suggesting it was limited in scope. And in fact, if you called this a war, you could be charged with discrediting the Russian military. And some Russian journalists have gone to prison for calling it a war as opposed to a special military operation. However, I think in mid-September, Putin began to realize that he needed something more. They mobilized 300,000 additional troops. And what they called for was referenda. The Russians organized referenda in these 4 areas of Ukraine: Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson Oblasts. The referenda were totally bogus. Illegal under international law. There was no credible observation. Literally, people voted at gunpoint, where ballot boxes were brought to their apartment, escorted by armed soldiers. And there was no provision for votes by the hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people who had fled those four regions during the war and were internally displaced in Ukraine or were elsewhere in Europe. Nevertheless, the Russians predictably reported large majorities of these regions having voted to join Russia. And on September 30th, Putin supposedly annexed those four regions. Even though the Russian military did not occupy all of those territories, and several days later, when asked, Putin's spokesperson could not define exactly what territory Ukraine was now supposedly part of Russia. I think Putin did this because by claiming these areas as Russian land, he was hoping to deter further Ukrainian counteroffensives. And the Ukrainians understandably ignored that. They pressed ahead with their counteroffensive. They liberated the area down here in the south of Kherson. And that was important. These blue areas really show what the Ukrainians have liberated since February 1. But in that area around Kherson, they pushed the Russians back to the eastern side of the Dnipro River. That river roughly bisects Ukraine. And since November, there's been no Russian military presence on the western side of the river. The Russians in the end of the last year began digging in defensive positions. And really over the last couple of months, the fighting has taken place around a city called Bakhmut, which you may have read about. This is an older map. It's kind of an interesting battle going on in Bakhmut in that, by all appearances, the city has no real strategic significance. There's no major rail or road junctions there. But the Wagner group, that's a private mercenary army that the Russians have organized, and the Russian army have been trying to take Bakhmut now for about 7 months. And it has achieved for the Russians, I think, huge symbolic importance. The Ukrainians, I think, attach symbolic importance to holding on to it. But I also think that what's at play here is that the Ukrainians calculate that the Russian desire to capture Bakhmut is such that they can inflict huge numbers of casualties on Russians. And there have been reports, particularly of these mobilized convicts, basically attacking prepared Ukrainian positions in human ways, and hundreds being killed, per day. So that's, I think, where the war is now. There's questions, there's suggestions the Russians may be preparing a new offensive. My guess is the Ukrainians are preparing for more counteroffensives, but probably later on in the spring. So the Kremlin expected to win this war fairly quickly. They're now almost a year into it. Why did the Kremlin make these miscalculations? What were the miscalculations? First of all, the Ukrainians completely underestimated the readiness of and the will of the Ukrainians to resist. I find this astonishing that the Kremlin did not understand their foe. The Ukrainians reported that they were captured soldiers north of Kyiv who were sent into battle with 3 days of rations. The Russians thought it would be over that quickly. I don't think most Western analysts did not. I mean, we expected the Ukrainians to fight. I was in Kyiv about 3 weeks before the Russians invaded. There was no doubt that Ukrainians were going to fight because they see this as an existential fight. If they lose, their democracy is gone, and the vision that motivates a lot of young Ukrainians of Ukraine becoming a normal European state is also gone. So that was one miscalculation. A second miscalculation was underestimating Ukrainian innovation. And the Ukrainians have been quite innovative in the tactics they've used. You probably recall in October, they used a car bomb to attack the Kerch Bridge, which links Russia proper with Crimea. In November, they used unmanned small boats to attack the Russian fleet in Sevastopol Harbor in Crimea. And then in November, they used long-range drones to attack a Russian bomber base from which the Russians fly bombers that then fire cruise missiles in Ukraine. And in this one picture here, you can see this white stuff. That's foam from an aircraft that was hit on the runway. A third miscalculation the Russians have made has been to overestimate Russian military capabilities. We've known for years that the Russian economy has a lot of corruption. There was no reason to assume that the Russian defense sector was immune from that corruption. And I think the best example of this was back in September. The Ukrainians said that they had captured this tank. It's a Russian T-80 tank. And you see those metal blocks along the side, along the hull, along the turret. That's explosive reactive armor blocks. And what they are designed to do is when an incoming shell comes in and hits one of those blocks, it actually explodes. But the force of the explosion is directed away from the tank and basically absorbs and protects the tank from the incoming shell. In September, the Ukrainians captured one of these tanks and they opened up one of these explosive reactor blocks and they said, wow, that's interesting. There's no explosive here. It's filled with rubber. Rubber's cheap, or cheaper than explosive. It doesn't protect the tank. And my expectation is somebody at the tank production facility calculated that these tanks are never going to see real action. Who will know? And so corruption means that a lot of the equipment on which the Russian military has spent hundreds of billions of dollars over the last 15 years probably does not perform up to expectation. Another miscalculation by the Russians was to underestimate the strength of the Western reaction. You saw the West come together fairly quickly, not only to take steps to defend NATO territory, but also to arm Ukraine. Provision, the French provided the long-range Caesar artillery shell, which outranges most Russian artillery. The United States provided the HIMAR rocket system, which can strike targets 50 miles away with an accuracy of about 25 feet. And the Ukrainians have used that to great effect to strike Russian ammunition depots, forcing the Russians to push those back, which has really complicated Russian logistics. And then, of course, we now know a week ago, the decision was finally taken by the West to begin providing Ukraine with main battle tanks. Another area that the Russians underestimated was the sanctions. For example, in February 1st of 2022, the Russian central bank had about $630 billion in foreign reserves. However, more than half of those reserves were in Western financial institutions. They have now been frozen and are unavailable to Russia. There's also been the cutoff of high-tech equipment, microchips, semiconductors, which has forced the shutdown of a lot of plants in Russia. And the Russians, I will give them credit, they've managed the effects of the sanctions fairly well, but they're still having an impact. Russia today faces double-digit inflation. Instead of continuing the post-COVID growth in 2022, the Russian economy declined by between 3% and 4%. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development projects that the Russian economy in 2023 will decline by 5.6%. The International Monetary Fund has a more generous estimate. They say that the Russian economy will basically not grow at all. It'll be at 0.3%. So I think the sanctions are beginning to have an impact, and it will accumulate. The latest sanctions that have been applied in December and then just last week are an effort by the European Union and the G7 to cap the price of oil and oil products that Russians sell. And the idea here is to have Russian oil on the market so global prices don't rise, but to cut the flow of revenues that go to Russia for sales of those projects. And what's basically happens is that most tankers, or many tankers that move Russian oil, and most of the insurance companies that insure those loads are in European Union countries, and those countries will no longer let their tankers ship Russian oil or their companies provide insurance unless the price is capped. And so while Russia is exporting oil now, exporting it to countries like, for example, China, those countries are able to get a significant discount. And I think these numbers are already beginning to show up. The Russian finance ministry just reported that the tax revenues that the Russian government receives from the sale of oil and gas in January of this year fell 46% compared to January of 2022. So why the Russian miscalculations? First of all, I don't think Vladimir Putin really understands Ukraine. The last time he was in Kyiv was in 2013, and he gave a speech, and the main point was, we Russians and Ukrainians are one people. That's an utterly tone-deaf thing to say in Ukraine, because many ethnic Ukrainians hear it as saying, you've just denied my language, my culture, my history. A second problem I think that Putin has is, and this goes back years, he operates in a fairly small inner circle. And most of the other members of that inner circle, like Putin, came from the security services. They share a worldview. It's not clear how much information gets into that circle. It's also clear if there's anybody in that circle who's prepared to speak truth to power. So Putin may not be getting the kind of advice he needs to make decisions about this war. And I think there's also been the additional impact of COVID. The Kremlin and Putin seem to be somewhat paranoid about COVID. The picture in the upper right is Putin meeting on February 21 last year to talk about Russian concerns about Ukraine. None of his senior staff are within 40 feet of him. The picture, the lower left, is where he's meeting with his defense minister and his chief of his general staff on February 28 last year. Presumably, these guys have been vaccinated, but they're sitting 25, 30 feet away from them. So I think that inner circle became even more compressed over the course of COVID, and that has probably restricted the amount of information that Putin gets. One last observation is that Putin, I believe, today, he's more emotional. He's a person who I think basically calculates costs and benefits. But over the past 10 or 15 years, I believe he's become more emotional, and that may be clouding his ability to make the kinds of calculations he should be making. So where does this thing go? Comes down to, I think, choices by Putin on the right and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on the left. Ideally, the Kremlin would conclude that the costs of this war outweigh whatever gains they hope to achieve and look for a way out. This war, I mean, it's certainly been a tragedy for Ukraine, but I would argue it's also been a disaster for Russia. However the war ends, Russia will emerge diminished in military terms, economic terms, and geopolitical terms. But thus far, the Kremlin does not seem to be drawing the appropriate conclusions. So there's several possible outcomes. One which I dismiss is that the Russian military wins, that the Russian military actually takes the eastern half of Ukraine. I just don't think the Russian military can do it, and most military experts say they just don't have the capability. So I would argue that however this war concludes, there is going to be a sovereign and independent Ukrainian state on the map of Europe, and it will be much larger than the rump state that the Kremlin intended to leave when it launched the invasion a year ago. A second outcome is that the Ukrainians win, that they drive the Russians back at least to the line on February 23 of last year. I would like to see that outcome, but I think sustaining the kind of counteroffensives that would be necessary, that will be difficult. The third outcome has basically been the view of the American intelligence community for probably the last half year, is that this war is going to settle down into a war of attrition, where neither side can make the breakthrough that militarily would win it. And then maybe this goes on for months or even years until perhaps mutual exhaustion sets in. And then at that point, could you have a real negotiation? Now, a real negotiation would require that the Russians drop their maximalist demands, which amount to basically total capitulation, demilitarization by Ukraine, neutrality, and Ukraine recognizing Russian absorption of a large portion of Ukraine's territory. And what's been interesting to me is that the Russians have basically been losing on the battlefield since August, but their demands of Ukraine have escalated. And that's simply not serious. Inside, I believe that the Ukrainians in March of last year were looking for a negotiated settlement. They were prepared to accept neutrality. There were some indications that I thought even suggested they might be prepared to discuss territorial concessions. That's now off the table, because both among the elite and also among the public, attitudes in Ukraine have hardened. And they've hardened because of things like this, the destruction inflicted on Mariupol, which was bombarded for 3 months by the Russian military before it was occupied. The estimate is that 90% of the structures in the cities were either destroyed or damaged in Russian fighting. Attitudes in Ukraine hardened by the revelations regarding what happened in places like Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanka, reports of mass executions, torture chambers, filtration camps. And so, one, I think Zelensky, his attitude is hardened, but also he's in a situation where the Ukrainian public would not give him much room to negotiate. There was a poll that was conducted in November, and this was after the Russians, having basically failed to make progress on the battlefield, begun this string of attacks aimed at civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. And the poll showed that 85% of Ukrainians wanted to continue the fight and oppose negotiations. Only like 8% favored negotiations. So it seems to me, looking at this war, the question is, which comes first? Do the sanctions and the flow of casualties back to Russia erode Russians' will to fight before economic difficulties and running out of weapons and ammunition erode Ukraine's ability to fight? And the United States and the West have a say in this. We can keep the Ukrainians in the game. So let me talk a little bit about the Biden administration policy. I think the president has worked very effectively with both NATO, but also with a group of 7 countries. And beginning in November, December of 2021, they were doing the diplomacy. And it wasn't just at the top, but each day you were talking about dozens of phone calls, meetings, Zoom sessions, sharing a lot of intelligence, an extraordinary amount of intelligence with allies. And thus, when the Russians actually invaded on February 24, NATO moved quite quickly. NATO countries began sending weapons to Ukraine, but also the United States and the European Union and others began imposing sanctions very quickly on Russia. Now, there's one red line I think that the administration and NATO adopted, is that while they will provide weapons to Ukraine, they will not provide American or NATO troops. And I think that's the right call. Russia can lose this war and it would not be existential for the Russian state. The Ukrainian army is not going to march on Moscow. The Ukrainians' goal is to drive Russia out of Ukraine. However, I think were the United States and NATO to enter with their troops, many in Moscow would then see this war not designed just to secure Ukraine's liberation of Ukrainian territory, but it would be aimed at the destruction of Russia. And then it would be seen as existential. So I think that's the right red line. But I do think that the administration could do more. The administration, when they talk about Ukraine, they say there are 2 goals here. On the one hand, they want to have the Ukraine help Ukraine win the war, defeat the Russians. On the other hand, they want to avoid a direct NATO-Russian military clash. And those are the right 2 objectives. But I think in finding the balance, the administration has been more timid than it might. And so I would hope that the administration, working with others in the West, can move to tighten sanctions on Russia, particularly in the energy area. But also I would argue that we should be accelerating the flow of weapons to Ukraine. A long war is not in Ukraine's interest. It's not in the West's interest. And what we should be doing is helping the Ukrainians achieve battlefield success that might begin to hasten a real negotiation that could end the war. So I think the broad goal for the US and the West here should be to help the Ukrainians persuade the Russians that they can't win, that ultimately they're going to lose. And by that, I mean helping get to a point where either the Russians withdraw their military from Ukraine or the Ukrainians achieve sufficient success on the battlefield where there's a negotiation that concludes with a settlement on terms that Ukraine can accept. And a lot of that is whether we can get the Russians to accept this map that was posted actually by the Canadian mission to NATO back in 2014. Ultimately, this is what we want to get the Russians to accept. Now, I'm not sure the Ukrainians can liberate all of their territory, but I do think that they can achieve more success on the battlefield that might get them to a negotiation that would ultimately be successful for Ukraine. And I hope that the United States and the West are able to consistently support, because as I said, we can keep Ukraine in this fight, and it's very much in the Western interest that Ukraine prevail. So let me stop at that point and be happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Ambassador Pifer. Any questions? Colin Hussey, I see your hand raised.
One of the variables, how do you figure Putin's health and his age? Because I mean, he's a dying old czar, trying to stay relevant. How what will happen if, you know, because he's eventually going to die, you know, whether it's next year or, you know, 3 or 4 years from now.
Right.
What,
Yeah, there's lots of speculation about Putin's health, but thus far I've not seen anybody who's offered that speculation. I haven't seen anybody who's either had a chance to examine him medically or had a chance to look at his medical records. And I go back to, I think, Bill Burns, a former friend and colleague who's now the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He made the observation back, I think, in July that as far as he could tell, Putin was entirely too healthy. So we don't know. I think if Putin were to disappear from the scene, his successor likely would be somebody who would pursue similar policies. But I do wonder if his successor might be someone who had less emotional attachment to the Ukraine war and might be able to take a more clear-eyed view of just how disastrous this is for Russia and adopt a different stance on Ukraine.
Cool. Bill Buchanan, I think you have a question. You have your hand raised. You want to?
Yes, Ambassador, thanks very much for this comprehensive overview. Very enlightening. And as you were talking, I'm remembering back to 1991 when I was a special agent in the FBI, sitting on the wall of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, watching armored personnel carriers race past in a cloud of dust, wondering what the hell is going on. Anyway, I don't have to tell you what happened here. There's another bump in the road, you know, in the adventures of the Soviets Communist Party. But my question is this. Putin, as one of his explanations, you know, for going into Ukraine, if I remember correctly, and, you know, jump in if I'm misremembering this, but I thought he said that the main reason that they wanted to go into Ukraine was not only what you said about, you know, historical explanations about the territory and all that, but because Russian-speaking folks in Eastern Ukraine were being abused and assaulted by these Nazis, you know, these Ukrainian Nazis and all that sort of thing. Does that lend to the possibility, and you know, that he would, you know, depending upon the three options that you gave for the outcome of this mess, doing the same thing with what's it called, Kaliningrad up there in the Baltics, which is I believe is Soviet territory, sandwiched between what, Latvia and Lithuania or something like that. You know, pretending that those citizens are being, you know, in danger or being assaulted like he claimed the ones in Eastern Ukraine, and using that as a pretext to go in and, I don't know, assault the Baltics. I think that's a possibility.
Yeah, well, I mean, Kaliningrad is an exclave sandwiched between Poland and Lithuania. I mean, it's actually part of Russia. But I think there is concern. I mean, in Estonia and Latvia, the population is probably ethnically about 20 to 25% Russian. And I think those two countries are nervous that a lot of the claims which Putin made about ethnic Russians or Russian speakers in Eastern Ukraine could be used to endanger those countries. So they certainly are, I think, much more nervous about Russia since the Russian actions in Ukraine, and this war really started back in 2014.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think you've seen now is, it was interesting, back in 1997, NATO said that in one of the efforts to try to assuage Russian concerns about NATO enlargement, NATO said that there would be no permanent stationing of substantial combat forces on the territory of new NATO member states. And up until 2014, there were no ground forces in NATO countries. After the Russians began the conflict in Ukraine, or after they seized Crimea and then got involved in the fighting in Donbass and Eastern Ukraine, NATO deployed small battalion-sized forces, about 1,000 to 1,200 men in each of the Baltic states and in Poland. And those were designed as tripwires, basically to assure those countries of NATO support. Well, since February of last year, those forces have been bolstered, and my guess is for the foreseeable future, you'll see in each of those countries a fairly significant NATO presence, a bit more than a tripwire force, because those countries understandably are made nervous by what the Russians are doing. And again, if you're sitting on territory that Putin has referred to as historic Russian lands, and you see what he's doing to what he regards as historic Russian lands in Ukraine, I can understand their nervousness.
Thank you. Very good.
All right.
Stephen, I see Susan Rowan has her hand up. So Susan, why don't you go? And then also Lauren Ward had a question earlier. Maybe you can just talk about whether or not the lessons we've learned from World War II are resurfacing as if we have forgotten them. But Susan, you go first.
Ambassador, thank you so much. I took notes. I took screenshots. This was like a course that I wish I had a year ago when this started, but thank you so much. So my question is, first of all, a lot of us who had family who came from what was then Russia or the Pale found out that we're now from Ukraine, which is totally changed things. But I wondered, the fact that so little was done when Russia invaded Crimea, do you find that that bolstered Putin in terms of further annexing?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's understandable, this confusion. I mean, remember that with the exception of a couple of chaotic years after World War I, what today is modern Ukraine, most of that was part of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union from 1654 until 1991. No, I do wonder, and I think it's a question you're asking is, had there been a more vigorous Western response to the Russian seizure and illegal annexation of Crimea, would that have had an impact? I think there was a tendency, a mistaken tendency in some parts of the West and in Europe, for example, to say, well, historically, Crimea was always part of Russia. Crimea was the one part of Ukraine where ethnic Russians constitute the majority of the population. That was true nowhere else in Ukraine. And so I think there was a certain readiness to sort of let that happen. Then the Russian military involvement in Donbass and eastern Ukraine, which began in April of 2014, that should have been another warning signal. So I think there is a question, had the West responded with more military support to Ukraine, had the West responded with harsher sanctions, would that have affected Russia? We don't know. It also may be, though, that Putin was so intent on, in his view, recovering these lands or taking Ukrainian territory, that it may not have had an impact. So, I mean, I look at the factors here. I mean, I think there are a variety of factors that led the Russians to this war, led the Kremlin to this war. One was concern that Ukraine was moving away from Russia. Now, the irony here is that nothing is done more to push Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West than Russian policy of the last 8 years, beginning with the seizure of Crimea, the war in Donbass. I mean, what did the Kremlin expect? A second factor at play here, I think, is about domestic politics within Russia. And that is, for the Kremlin, a democratic, Western-oriented Ukraine with a growing market economy is a nightmare. Because that kind of Ukraine causes Russians to say or ask why they can't have the same political voice, the same democracy that Ukrainians have. And job number one for the Kremlin is regime preservation. But I think the third factor here, and the factor that will perhaps sort of push this over, was Putin. I'm not sure if with any other leader in the Kremlin other than Vladimir Putin, that this war would have happened. But I'm not sure we're all going to have a real knowledge of these guys when they retire. They don't usually write tell-all memoirs that let us sort of figure out what happened, and the real notes of what go on in these discussions probably aren't going to be available to historians for decades and decades and decades, if ever.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Ambassador. And Lauren Ward had a question earlier. Did we forget the lessons of World War II? Lauren, if you need to expound on that.
Yeah, I was born in 1941, and my generation has many memories of World War II, and we've studied World War II because it had such an influence on our lives. And I'm looking at this through that lens, and I see Putin behaving much as Hitler did, claiming that Hitler was going to the Sudetenland because he was protecting the ethnic Germans who were there. I see the failure to respond to Crimea as simply encouraging his expansionist inclinations. And so I'm just wondering if we as a nation have forgotten the lessons of World War II, and if we're not seeing a similar buildup in Europe as to what occurred back then, leading us to potentially World War III.
Well, I think the West, has come back to those lessons, perhaps belatedly, but I think there now is a pretty common understanding, both in Washington and in most NATO capitals, of what is at stake here. Now, again, I do think that the red line that has been drawn by NATO and the United States and individual NATO countries of not providing their troops, I think that's the right red line. I think if you have American and NATO troops in this war, you are looking at a direct NATO-Russia clash militarily, and that can go in a very bad way very quickly. But I do think that the Russian red lines actually allow quite a bit more than what we have been doing. So I'm glad to see that we're providing main battle tanks to the Ukrainians now. I think there are other weapon systems. I think we should be giving them what's called ATACMS. ATACMS is a rocket that's fired by that HIMARS vehicle that I showed earlier. But the ATACMS has a range of 200 miles, and it's very accurate. Now, some are concerned, and I think the White House is concerned, that using American weapons to conduct deep strikes into Russia could be an escalation that could trigger a very negative Russian response. If that's the case, tell the Ukrainians you can have ATACMS, you cannot use them against Russian proper. And in fact, the Ukrainians have said, we will pledge that we will use no American provided weapons to strike targets in Russia. What ATACMS would allow, though, the Ukrainians to do is hit farther targets back in Crimea and elsewhere in occupied Ukraine, and cause the Russians to further push their logistics back. And, by driving, for example, Russian ammunition dumps back away from the front lines, what you've seen, and we saw in the course of the summer, was a fairly dramatic fall off and decline in how many artillery shells the Russians were using. At one point in, I think, June, the Ukrainians were reporting that they were being hit with 30,000 to 40,000 artillery shells a day. And that began dropping off, in part because instead of having their ammunition dumps 15 miles behind the line, they had to move them back to 40 miles behind the line to protect them from being attacked by HIMARS rockets. Let's make them push them back all the way into Russia. I think that logistic complications would further weaken the Russians' ability both to mount offensives, but also to sustain a defense. And I think even when you're talking about aircraft, NATO air forces are going to be retiring a lot of F-16s. You can give those to the Ukrainians and say, you can use these for air defense, and you can use these for ground attack on targets within Ukraine. So we can stay away, we can kind of abide by that line, but we can still, I believe, give the Ukrainians a lot of military capability that they could put to very good use.
Cool. All right. Doug Bowers, followed by Bert Hill, questions.
Mr. Ambassador, on Monday, the Wall Street Journal reported that Iran is set to build a drone factory in Russia, producing over 6,000 drones. It would seem that if there is a safe place for that kind of thing to go on, that there is no end to the bombardment that Ukraine will suffer over the years. How would you respond?
Yeah, I think that's troublesome. I do wonder if there are ways that the West can put pressure on the Iranians not to do that. Having said that, I think also for a variety of reasons, U.S. leverage with Iran in this regard is fairly limited. So the question, I think, then becomes, can we help the Ukrainians come up with air defense measures, particularly air defense measures that do not require air defense missiles that are many times more expensive than the drones. But it does appear that the Ukrainians have become fairly skilled about knocking these things down. And so we have to help them develop further these capabilities. What's interesting to me, though, is that the fact that Russia is turning to Iran for these kind of drones suggests that the Russians may be running low on some of their more sophisticated weapons. And we've seen this in other areas that, for example, the Russians are now using S-300s, and S-300 is basically it's an anti-aircraft missile. It fires surface to air, but of course you can also use it in a surface-to-surface mode. The Russians are sometimes using S-300s. There was this horrible destruction of an apartment block that killed 45 people about 3 weeks ago. The missile the Russians used, that was a missile that was originally designed to attack American aircraft carriers at sea. And the Russian turn to this and turn to the Iranian drones suggests that they're running very low on some of their more accurate cruise missiles. So if we can give the Ukrainians, and things like the Patriot air defense system are coming, more sophisticated air defenses, they may be able to reduce their vulnerability, those kinds of attacks. But this is also a reason why I think a long war is not good for Ukraine. It's also, it will be a challenge to sustain public support in the West for that war. It's also, to my mind, a reason why the West should be providing the Ukrainian military with more weapons now, so that they can try to achieve success on the battlefield that would either bring about a Russian withdrawal or a more serious Russian approach to a negotiation.
Ambassador, I have a quick question. I have to leave shortly. Is there a specific charity that you recommend that we wanted to help out? Where we fund?
There's a whole range. I mean, AmeriCares is doing work in Ukraine. There's a group that actually has been called Nova Ukraine, which is online, that Stanford students have been very involved in, which I've contributed to. So it's not hard. There's another group called Come Back Alive. And my wife and I have contributed to them. They do not provide lethal equipment, but they do help fund buying things like body armor, medical equipment that does go to the Ukrainian military. But it's basically, give soldiers in the field a better chance of surviving. So there's quite a range out there.
Okay, yeah, my Kiwanis Club has donated money to Nova Ukraine.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that they've done quite a bit of good work, and like I said, we donated to that group as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Bert, you're at your hand raised.
Yes, Eurasia. I'm curious about, it seems to me, I am not an expert in Russia, although I've traveled in Russia during the Glasnost period, teaching economics. But one of the things that I had picked up was the fact that the Crimea was assigned to Russia in the Soviet Union, and in 1958, Khrushchev ceded it over to can't think of the name of it, a transfer over. Do you know anything about that, or do you remember it?
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't dispute that Russia has a historical claim to Crimea. I mean, it was colonized by Catherine the Great. Sevastopol, which is probably the best harbor in the Black Sea, was specifically, the city of Sevastopol was founded by the Russians to be the home port for the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And in Soviet times, Crimea was part of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic until 1954, when to mark the 300th anniversary of the Treaty of Pereyaslav in 1654, which is the treaty that the Russians say, by which Ukraine joined Russia. The Ukrainians have a different interpretation of that treaty. But in 1954, Khrushchev had it transferred administratively from Russia to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. So yeah, I think there's a historic Russian claim. However, there was an agreement by all of the republics that emerged from the wreckage of the Soviet Union in 1991 that they would accept and respect the borders existing in 1991. And there was a very, I believe, smart reason for that, is trying to redraw the borders to accommodate the different ethnic groups and things like that. It would have been a nightmare. And so you have Russia in a series of agreements. I mean, as I mentioned, the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 agreeing to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and its territorial integrity. In the 1997 Russian-Ukraine Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, the Russians again said they would respect Ukraine's borders. There were a number of occasions in the 1990s when the Russian Duma, that's the lower house of their legislative branch, made claims to either Crimea or Sevastopol. And Boris Yeltsin said, no, Crimea, Sevastopol, they are Ukrainian territory. We've agreed to that. Yeah, I think there was certainly, you can go back and you can look at what happened in 1954. But in 1991, there was this agreement that Crimea would be part of Ukraine. Now, I would argue that up until 2014, the two biggest Russian interests in Crimea were how were ethnic Russians being treated and the status of the Black Sea Fleet. And there was nothing to suggest that there was any mistreatment of ethnic Russians in Crimea. In fact, ethnic Russians held most of the local and regional positions of power. And the second Russian concern was the Black Sea Fleet. The problem the Russians have is that they don't have enough port facilities in Russia proper to support the Black Sea Fleet, so they needed Sevastopol and other facilities. And the Ukrainians, in 2014, the Ukrainians had an agreement with Russia that was extended, I think, until like 2047, allowing the Russians to use those facilities. So the two major interests that Russia had in Crimea were not endangered. Yet the Russians went ahead and tried to seize the territory. And I think that was a result of their panic about what happened at the end of the Maidan Revolution in Kyiv in 2014.
Okay, thank you. I was stationed in Troitsk during the time that I was there. I don't know if you know Troitsk, but it was a very interesting place, kind of like our what's the name of it, where scientific work was done. It wasn't a well-known place. Anyway, thank you.
Sure.
All right, Steve Shane, you had a question? You read hand raised? You're on mute. You have to come off mute. Steve, you're on mute. Still on mute. You're still muted.
How about now?
Go.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. How and who is going to pay for the rebuilding of Ukraine?
Yeah, that's going to be a really big bill. I think the estimates are now at a minimum $500 to $600 billion to rebuild the housing, the infrastructure, and the industry.
Mm-hmm.
What I would like to see is the West has now frozen about $300 billion in Russian central bank assets. I would like to see the West move to seize those assets and give them to Ukraine's reconstruction. Thus far, the Treasury Department has a concern about that. And I think, their concern is not one that can be dismissed lightly. But their concern is, what does that then do to the status of the dollar as sort of the world currency? I think you can say that, countries that brutally launch the kind of war we've seen that Russia's launched against Ukraine, shouldn't expect to have their assets protected. But I also think there's a political issue here. I think at the end of the day, politically, how does our president, how do leaders in Europe and Japan, how would they explain to their publics, we are asking you to come up with tens of billions of dollars to help rebuild Ukraine, at the same time that we're giving the Russian central bank back its $300 billion. There's already some thinking in trying, the International Monetary Fund is beginning to think through how they can do this. It's going to be a difficult proposition. But as I said, I personally believe that ways should be found. And I'm told by people who are lawyers that this can be done to seize those Russian assets and then put them to use repairing the damage that the Russian military has done.
Okay, good.
Any other questions? Doug, you have your hand raised again, or Carl? Carl, yeah, then Doug.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Mr. Ambassador, if you have any thoughts on why it's going to take 6 months for the Germans to deliver their tanks. It's going to take us about a year to deliver our tanks. I can remember back when the Golan Heights was being overrun. Nixon got tanks to them, I think, within about 24 hours. Why can't we move them now?
Yeah, I would like to see us move them faster. I think we probably can, and my guess is we probably will. I think some of the difficulty comes in, at least some of the tanks that they're talking about are in reserve status. And there's a certain amount of time that you need to go in, maintain the tanks, basically get them ready so that they can actually be used. There'll be a certain amount of time to train the Ukrainians on how to operate Leopards and Abrams, although one thing I believe is we've been concerned over the past year that how long it will take to train the Ukrainians. In fact, what we found is the Ukrainian military, if you take a Ukrainian soldier who's operated a T-72 tank, it's not going to take him that long to figure out how to operate an Abrams or a Leopard. And the Ukrainians have actually been quite fast on picking these things up. The more difficult thing maybe is how do you train Ukrainians on how to maintain the tanks? Because again, I think that the red line about not providing troops also applies as we're not prepared to send American soldiers into Ukraine to maintain the Abrams tank. And that is one, I think the Abrams tank is probably one of the best in the world, but one of the criticisms is it does require a lot of heavy maintenance. So it may be that the maintenance takes some time, but I think we can actually physically get tanks there. I mean, the US Marines a year and a half ago divested themselves of about 300 M1 Abrams tanks. Those tanks presumably were in good operating order when they were in the Marines. Those, to my mind, ought to be candidates for early transfer if we wanted to. Now, I think there is one factor here, is the most modern variant of the Abrams tank, as I understand it, has a special kind of armor that's very sensitive, and there is concern about not sending that tank into a place where the Russians could get a hold of it. But they're older variants of the Abrams tank, which can be made available quite quickly. And my guess is that while people are talking about months and years now, I suspect that we're going to see those flows accelerate. But even if some of those tanks can't arrive for 3 or 4 months, what it does tell the Ukrainians is they can use their current tanks now and put them at risk, knowing that there are replacements coming in down the line. And so that does affect how the Ukrainians might be able to run some of their operations in the coming months.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Oh,
Yeah, one more.
All right, go ahead. Anybody else before we go back to Steve? Nope. Okay, Steve.
What are the casualties currently on both sides?
Unknown. The Ukrainians claim to, I think, have killed 130,000 Russians so far. My guess is that number is exaggerated. But what I saw was an interesting figure. I think it came from the Norwegian defense minister about a week and a half ago, where he said that the Russians had at this point suffered 200,000 casualties, killed and wounded in action. And that would be not inconsistent with a view. I think the Defense Department last August said 80,000 total Russian casualties, and in November said over 100,000. And what you've seen, I think, in the last 3 months is probably a level of fighting that has been particularly high casualty for the Russians, particularly around Bakhmut, where it seems the Russians have moved in a lot of these convicts with very little training, a lot of the mobilized people, again, with little training, and were basically sent in human waves to sort of probe Ukrainian lines, and then that information would be used for follow-up attacks by more experienced soldiers. But I mean, the Ukrainians are reporting literally killing hundreds of people a day around Bakhmut because of the way that they're making these open field attacks. On the Ukrainian side, I don't know. Again, in November, I think the chairman of the Joint Chiefs said about 100,000 casualties on the Russian side, something similar on the Ukrainian side. I think the Ukrainians have probably suffered fewer casualties, in part because for most of the war, they've been fighting a defensive battle. And so they can fight from prepared positions and things like that. But again, I don't think we have, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians are releasing credible figures on the question.
Yeah.
Okay, Doug, do you still have your hand raised or?
I still do, yes. We should remind ourselves that Alaska was a part of historic Russia at one point, and probably have no plans on giving that back.
I don't think so. Yeah, this is
Well, my question is concerns Crimea. That there seems to be three primary roads in. One is through the Black Sea, which is already shown to be susceptible to being stopped. The other one is the Kerch Bridge, which is also susceptible of being stopped. The other one is the land bridge. If Ukraine was able to take over Crimea, do you think that would materially change the war?
Yeah, I think the Russians are vulnerable in Crimea, and my guess is that there's some thinking in Ukraine to launching an attack into Zaporizhia that would allow them to break the land bridge. Again, if we would give them ATACMS, they could range and strike the Kerch Bridge, which I think is a legitimate military target. And they could also strike the ferry terminals in places like Kerch and on the opposite side in Russia. And the Russians have been using those ferry terminals to bring supplies in. So they could make it difficult to support the Russian military in Crimea. Actually attacking Crimea, though, I think that's going to be hard. I know there's a retired U.S. Army General, Ben Hodges, who believes the Ukrainians could take Crimea by the end of the summer. I would like to think he's right, but you know, an assault on Crimea means really fighting across an isthmus that's only about 6 miles wide. And I believe the Russians are already fortifying that. The Russians can fortify that. And I think that would be a very difficult task for the Russian military, or for the Ukrainian military, to conduct that kind of assault. And it's also complicated, I believe, by the fact that of all the pieces of Ukraine that Russia now occupies, Crimea matters most. You know, they will fight for Crimea in a way that they might not fight for Zaporizhia, Kherson, or the Donbass. So I think that's a pretty difficult military operation. Not saying the Ukrainians can't do it, but I think it would be really, really hard.